Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. And today we talked about the Cold War abroad thus far in places all over the world, but we haven't talked about what the Cold War did here in America. So, Americans throughout their history, and most recently after 9/11, have been faced with the difficult task of balancing the need to provide national security with the need to protect people's individual rights and freedoms. And in times of crisis like World War II, those rights have been sometimes limited for some people. Beginning in the late 1940s, though, the Cold War starts to grip American life because of this new Red Scare at home. The hunt for communists netted some spies, but it also gets a lot of innocent Americans as well. So the first Red Scare, if you remember, took place after the Russian Revolution in 1917 in the early 1920s. There were nativists going around who didn't like immigrants, who especially didn't like communism. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial because they were radicals and anarchists, and we didn't like them, so we were afraid of anything foreign. This Red Scare is the fear of communism outside and inside America, and it lasts longer, it goes deeper, and it's broader than the previous one. And so this one has a broader effect on American life, and it reaches more people. And it's because of the spread of communism in Eastern Europe and China. This raises concerns that there might be communists in America, and some even in government positions that are working for the enemy. And the government reaction to this, one was the Federal Employee Loyalty Program, where the FBI was given the authority to investigate 3.2 million government employees, and they end up firing only 212 as security risks. 3,000 rather resigned because they felt it violated their rights. Also, the Attorney General could compile a list of subversive organizations in the United States, or organizations that they deem are communist related. And Americans who are affiliated with those organizations were singled out for more scrutiny, and some even lost their jobs simply for being associated with that organization. The Smith Act was passed in 1940, but it was used later on against communist and socialist workers' parties members, and it makes it an offense to advocate or belong to a group that advocates the violent overthrow of the government. Kind of reminds you of the Sedition Act, but it also requires that all non-citizen adult residents of the United States register with the government. And in 1938 and later on, it becomes more, I don't know, I guess popular, you could say, is HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee. And what HUAC does is they investigate. They're a House committee, so we're talking Congress. Congress has dozens of committees and subcommittees that people must be on, and it's usually in areas of expertise. Well, this was a committee to investigate un-American activities in the United States, the possible subversive activities of fascists, communists, and Nazis. It investigates people in the government, the armed forces, labor unions, the education system, scientists, newspapers, and many, many other aspects of American life to see if they were connected to communism. And in 1947, they begin they begin investigating people in Hollywood because they feel that communists in Hollywood are sneaking propaganda into films that will influence other people to become communist. And people were brought, famous actors, Walt Disney, Ronald Reagan is an actor, future president, who goes before HUAC to testify, basically just to tell them that they've never done business with communists. Walt Disney had to disclose that he had done some business with Russia, but here's all we did, that was it. And a group in Hollywood of left-wing directors and writers who called themselves the Hollywood 10 refused to testify, and they were sent to prison for contempt of Congress. Just like if you don't answer in courts, you're held in contempt. Same thing in Congress. And studio directors and people who were in charge of Hollywood begin keeping a blacklist of people who allegedly had communist backgrounds. It didn't even have to be true, but if you were on that blacklist, you weren't getting hired, and it ruined some of the best actors' careers in the 1950s, or late 1940s. And then we have the spy cases, the two spy cases that gripped the nation during the late 1940s and mid 1950s. The first one was Alger Hiss. Hiss is a great State Department employee. He goes to the Yalta Conference with Roosevelt. He helps with some New Deal programs. Like he's a outstanding government employee. He has a spotless record. But he is accused of spying for the Soviet Union in 1948 by a former communist spy called Whittaker Chambers. And Whittaker is being interviewed by HUAC. He names Alger Hiss. And Alger Hiss is such a prominent diplomat that people think he couldn't be spying for the Soviet Union. So he testifies before HUAC himself and claims his innocence, but Chambers had evidence that proved that they knew each other and that he had passed him secret documents, and it basically proved Alger Hiss guilty. He goes to prison for 3.5 years of a 5-year sentence. He claims his innocence until his death, but in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union goes under and there's a lot of declassified documents from that country, it basically proved that he was guilty. And the second spy case has to do with passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. They had developed an atom bomb much, much quicker than anyone had anticipated. And one of those reasons was because Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Julius was a scientist in the Manhattan Project, and both of them had given atomic secrets to the Soviets. They denied the charges and plead the Fifth Amendment, saying they don't have to incriminate themselves or they don't have to testify and say that they did it. The prosecution must prove that they did it. They feel they're being persecuted because they are Jewish, and this is an anti-Semitic case, and they have radical beliefs. But they are found guilty, and they are sentenced to death in the electric chair. They're the first U.S. citizens executed for espionage. This is a huge case, very controversial. People didn't think they had enough evidence to go on. They thought they just threatened them with the death penalty so they would show or tell more people that they knew in the Manhattan Project who were spies. But in the 1990s, again, the Soviet Union releases documents that were revealed that the Americans had spied for the Soviets. It was a list of Americans who had spied, and it had Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs on it, so it did prove their guilt. And those were called the Verona Papers. And then finally we get to Joseph McCarthy. And Joseph McCarthy is a little-known senator in his first term from Wisconsin. He's coming up for re-election. He hasn't really done much in his first term. And so he decides to stake his claim on anti-communism, and he claims in a stump speech in West Virginia to claim to have the names of communists in the State Department. First it was 205, then it was 57, and the number changes every time. But the point is, he never produces a single name. And so throughout the next 5 or 6 years, he is able to get reelected, and he just keeps accusing people. The point is that people are all caught up on this witch hunt for communists that he doesn't have to provide any evidence. Namely, the accusation is enough to be guilty of being a communist. And so much so that his name comes to be known as extreme reckless charges of suspected communists with no evidence. And even today, you could say McCarthyism and its extreme reckless charges against somebody with no evidence. Not necessarily communism, but it was in the 1950s. And so he accuses George Marshall, the architect of the Marshall Plan, of being a communist. And then finally, he starts going after larger and larger fish, so to speak. And in 1954, he makes accusations against the U.S. Army officials. And they basically say it's a personal attack. And so the Senate committee holds a hearing to find out more about it, and those were called the Army McCarthy hearings, and they were televised, and people watched them. They were intrigued by this, and basically they got to see McCarthy for the first time, and that was the magic of television coming into everybody's homes in the 1950s. They got to see this stuff for the first time. They saw how he treated witnesses. They saw how he bullied people, and they didn't like it. And so he has no proof. People see that, and so he alienates his supporters. He dies a couple years later, suffering from alcoholism. And however, those same documents in the 1990s that were released by the Soviets proved that McCarthy was correct in his accusations on at least some of his accounts. But basically, if you cast a net that wide, you're going to catch a couple of fish, I guess. And so the causes and effects of McCarthyism, you can see everybody's caught up in this witch hunt because the Soviets have those satellite states in Eastern Europe. They developed the atomic bomb. Korean War ends in a stalemate. We lose China to communism. And Republicans, because of that, accuse Truman, the Democrat, of being soft on communism. And the effects of McCarthyism and this Red Scare are that millions of Americans must take the loyalty oaths at work. Even people that weren't in the government had to take loyalty oaths at work. Activism by labor unions goes into decline because labor unions can fight for workers' rights, which can be construed as communism. Many people are afraid to speak out on public issues for fear of being labeled a communist, because remember, the accusation is enough to bring guilt against somebody. And this whole anti-communism drives the U.S. foreign policy in the 1950s with containment, massive retaliation, brinksmanship, and later on we'll get to the 1960s with Kennedy, and he'll switch it up a little bit. But that is topic 10. We'll get to that in a couple of weeks. Go ahead and fill out your learning targets, bring them back to class. That's all I have for you tonight. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.